When I was a child, I believed family was the safest place of all. But then I grew up, got married, and realized sometimes the very people sitting at your dinner table are the ones most willing to push you off a cliff. I was once the silent wife, the submissive daughter-in-law, and finally the woman betrayed at her own family table. But my story didn't end there. It was only the beginning. This is not a story about failure. This is the story of how a woman rose from ashes, turned pain into power, and reclaimed everything she was told she had lost. Chapter 1. The last dinner in the house that bore my husband's name. I once thought that Thanksgiving that year would be the final chance to hold on to something that had been broken for far too long. I had spent an entire week preparing the dinner, carefully choosing each pumpkin, each bundle of herbs. The oven had been running since dawn, and the kitchen was filled with an aroma that felt like a hymn soothing the soul. I didn't do it to impress anyone. I did it because it was tradition, because it was something I had safeguarded through 22 years of marriage with Taylor. And deep down, I hoped it could bring my children back to this table, like in the old days when they were still little ones who believed that family was the safest place in the world. But that night, nothing was the way I had imagined. Taylor walked into the dining room in a suit so immaculate, it was absurd for a family gathering. Holly, the new secretary, barely in her 20s, the one I had pretended not to be jealous of, trailed after him, as though the whole thing had already been rehearsed. I stood there, wiping my hands on an apron embroidered with my children's names. The moment I saw them, I understood this wasn't a family dinner. This was the funeral of my marriage. Taylor sat at the head of the table like a weary king, casting a glance over the food I had spent the day preparing, then at me as though I were nothing more than a familiar servant. He didn't smile. He didn't thank me. He simply looked around coldly and sighed. "We should be direct," he began, without the courtesy of any preamble. "I've decided to sell this house. Holly and I are moving to San Diego. She's pregnant. There are moments in life when time seems to stop. People call it shock. But to me, it felt like my soul had been ripped out of my body, while the shell was forced to remain standing there, listening to words slicing through every fiber of my being. I didn't look at Holly. I didn't ask a single question. I just turned back into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, as though, if I could do something familiar enough, the world might somehow return to normal. But it didn't. Minutes later, my daughter, the only one still speaking to me after the family argument a few months back, stood up and followed Holly into the backyard. I heard them laughing. At that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't hurl plates like in some soap opera. I simply looked down at the dinner table, at the turkey marinated with the recipe my mother had passed down, and realized that the only thing still intact here was the food. As for me, I had been eroded long ago. That was the moment I knew I had to do something, not for revenge, but for survival, to keep from being buried under the suffocating layers of pretense called family. And that very night, I began to rewrite my destiny, starting with a thick envelope I had hidden away in the drawer. Chapter 2. Secret Files and Old Lies. I still remember precisely the feeling when my fingers touched the edge of that envelope. It lay quietly in the drawer beneath an old tablecloth alongside the handwritten letters I once wrote to Taylor back when we were newlyweds. Letters that were never sent because perhaps I had stopped believing that sincerity could save a man so cold. But the envelope was different. It held the truth. A truth I had been quietly preparing for 3 years, ever since my instincts warned me that the man I once called my husband was hiding something from me. Inside were copies of the house deed, our joint accounts. The company transfer papers funded by the savings from my parents. And finally, the financial assessment I had commissioned from an independent expert when Taylor began sneaking around with his so-called private investments. I had known for a long time that he intended to erase me from his life, not with words, but with the law and with money. The only thing I hadn't expected was that he would do it so brazenly as to bring that woman into our home on Thanksgiving. I laughed to myself when I remembered the look in Taylor's eyes the moment he realized I still kept the old contract, bearing both our signatures. A part of me still wanted to believe he had once been a decent man, but lies. They know no shame. It took me 3 years to prepare, but only 3 hours that night to understand it was time to act. And I no longer had the luxury of waiting for some miracle of family to arrive. The very next morning, I went to the law office, whose business card I had kept from a financial seminar the year before. I walked in with my head held high, carrying a beige handbag filled with living proof of everything I'd contributed to this marriage. And then I said words I never thought I'd have the courage to speak. I don't just want a divorce. I want to reclaim what belongs to me, and I want to do it quietly, intelligently, until it's too late for them to react. My lawyer was a woman. Her name was Elaine, her eyes sharp as though she could see through any contract ever written. She didn't look at me as a betrayed wife, but as a partner, a woman rising from the ashes. Elaine said something I will never forget. They've been playing a Cold War for years. Now it's your turn to redraw the map. I left her office that day with a detailed plan in my head. No one knew, not Taylor, not Holly, not anyone from the circle that had reduced me to nothing more than a decoration in my own home. I would remain silent. I would cook, I would smile, and I would remove brick by brick from their castle. And when it finally collapsed, they would never understand how I had vanished, taking with me everything they once believed was untouchable. Chapter 3, A Mother and a Betrayer. I once thought I could endure everything, until the day they hurt my mother. She was the only one who had never turned her back on me. When I decided to marry Taylor, she disapproved, yet she still stood there, handed me my grandmother's necklace, and said, "When you cry, don't let anyone see, but when you rise, let the whole world witness it." I carried those words in my heart through all the years I lived in the Turner Mansion, a place I never once felt was home. When I began my plan, I would often visit my mother on Sunday afternoons alone without Taylor, without the children. I never spoke of what was happening. I would quietly wash dishes, dust the shelves, and sit with her on the old armchair. She never asked much, but I knew she saw everything through eyes that had lived far more than I could imagine. Then one day, she suffered a stroke. I received the call while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner for the Turner household, a dinner I was not allowed to sit and eat. I rushed to the hospital, flowers still clinging to my hair, my hands trembling. She survived, but when she woke, the first thing she asked was, "Do you still want to stay with those who have killed your soul?" I didn't answer. I only held her hand, and I knew. From that moment, she didn't need me to answer. She already knew. I canceled all my appointments with the lawyer that week. I couldn't think, couldn't calculate. I could only sit by her side. Then, on the 5th day when I returned to the mansion, I found Taylor using my office to make a call with the door unlocked. On the laptop screen was a contract for the purchase of company shares, registered under Holly, his mistress, not me, not the woman who had funded that very company with her dowry from her mother. I froze. Taylor looked at me as if I were a maid who had wandered into the wrong room. No shame, no explanation. In that very moment, I understood one thing. My mother hadn't nearly died from old age. Her heart had shattered from watching her daughter reduced to a shadow in the household of a coward. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply turned to leave, and before closing the door, I spoke one sentence. "You have no idea what sentence you just signed for yourself, Taylor." That night, I called Elaine. She heard my voice over the phone and didn't need me to explain further. "I understand," she said. We begin phase 2. Over the next few weeks, I quietly transferred every document, every financial statement, every piece of evidence of his infidelity from the family server onto my personal USB drive. I dug deep into places they never imagined I could reach. I even uncovered the revised prenuptial agreement Taylor had forced me to sign after I gave birth while I was still lying in a hospital bed. They thought I was weak. They thought I was naive, but I was only waiting for the right moment. And that moment, it was drawing very near. Chapter 4, The game begins. I began to disappear, not in the way someone packs a suitcase and vanishes into the night rain, but in a quiet, deliberate way, without leaving a trace. I no longer argued with Georgia whenever she made snide remarks about my being an unqualified mother. I didn't react when Stephanie scrutinized the bruise under my eye with faux concern. I smiled, nodded, and said thank you. I shrank in their eyes, small, weak, passive, exactly what they wanted me to become. And then I began to dig. I found things they never thought I was smart enough to understand. A Swiss bank account under Georgia's name receiving monthly transfers from Taylor's company. An unsent email from Stephanie to her lawyer, cancel the old will, change the beneficiary, and in the notes section, one chilling line, only keep Liam if absolutely necessary. Liam, my son. This was no longer a battle for dignity. It had become a fight for that child's survival. I hired a private investigator. Elaine recommended her, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and eyes as sharp as a scalpel. Her name was Carla. She didn't ask me, is your husband abusive? She didn't ask, do you have any proof? She simply looked at me and said, where do you want me to start? I told her, start from the day I stepped into that house. 3 weeks later, Carla handed me an external hard drive and a warning. Once you watch what's in here, you'll never see them as ordinary people again. I watched. I cried. I vomited. Then I stood up, wiped away my tears, and began rewriting my own chessboard. The counterattack plan was built on 3 pillars. Truth. Undeniable concrete evidence of everything they had done, from embezzling company funds to forging medical documents about my health after a fall. Exposure. No whispering behind backs, but letting the entire city witness the masks of nobility fall from their faces. The final blow. A public enough event, grand enough, with enough witnesses that my words couldn't be erased, couldn't be denied. I chose Taylor and Holly's wedding, a lavish ceremony hosted at a 5-star hotel in the heart of the city. Just the way the Turner family liked it, media presence, politicians, a guest list so long, no one would even notice me. The ex-wife they once claimed had miscarried and disappeared. I would go, not as a disruptor, but as a survivor, and I wouldn't go alone. Chapter 5. The Return of the Vanished. The day of Taylor and Holly's wedding unfolded under brilliant golden sunlight, like a perfectly staged scene crafted by the universe itself. A modern-day royal wedding, a lavish gown bridesmaids, who looked like models' guests, who were politicians, business elites, and aristocrats, in crisp suits raising flutes of champagne, their laughter polished and pretentious. I entered the grand hall like a ghost risen from the past. No one recognized me immediately. I was no longer the frail, pale woman with a pregnant belly and dark circles under her eyes from 3 years ago. Now I wore a form-fitting black dress, my face meticulously made up my gaze, sharp and unwavering. A woman no longer afraid. It wasn't until Stephanie turned her head and her eyes landed on me that her smile froze midair, suspended by the weight of her own guilt. I walked toward the table of honor where the entire Turner family was seated. Alex, my ex-husband, the man who once stood silently as I collapsed at the foot of the stairs, now sat beside his soon-to-be bride Holly. She was beautiful, but naive. I pitied her. She had no idea the den of vipers she was walking into. I stopped right in front of them. Alex stammered, What are you doing here? I smiled gently, placing a thick envelope on the table. Inside was everything: Liam's birth certificate, DNA test results, photos, videos, hospital records, and an excerpt from the final will of Mr. Kyle Turner, the only person in that family who had once asked me, "Are you happy, my dear?" I turned to the crowd. "Excuse me," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I don't mean to interrupt such a grand occasion. But before Alex walks up there to make vows again, I think everyone deserves to know a small truth, that he already has a 3-year-old son. A child this family publicly declared dead simply because I didn't meet the Turner family's aristocratic standards." A deadly silence blanketed the entire ballroom. And if anyone here still cares about ethics or legality, please be advised that child is the sole legal heir to the Turner estate, according to the final will of Mr. Kyle Turner, who saw the truth before any of you did. Georgia shot up from her seat. Stephanie's face turned ghostly pale. Alex looked as though he'd turned to stone. I looked him straight in the eye. You once said you didn't want a child with someone like me. Well, congratulations. You can't have children with anyone now. Then I pulled a folded document from my purse and laid it in front of Alex. Infertile now. His face drained of all color. I didn't wait for their reactions. I turned and walked out of that hall amidst the stunned silence of the crowd. No apologies, no applause, no dramatic curtain close. I didn't need them to validate my existence, because this time I hadn't come seeking recognition. I came to reclaim the truth and restore justice to its rightful place. Chapter 6, Silent Women Are Not Powerless Women. I never returned to the hotel after that day. I didn't want to know how they reacted when they opened the envelope. I didn't need to hear their justifications, excuses, or accusations. I had spent too many years listening to them until I could no longer hear myself. I left that very night to a small house in the suburbs I had bought 2 years earlier under my name and my son's. The house wasn't big, but it had enough sunlight for Liam to run around the yard and enough peace that I no longer flinched at the sound of a door opening. I planted roses the kind Georgia once said only suit losers, trying to lull themselves to sleep. Now every neighbor walking by would stop and ask what I used to make them bloom so beautifully. I answered I water them with years of being overlooked. Some might think I'm the kind of woman who harbors grudges, but I don't. I simply remember. Remember so I never forget who I once was and how I was treated. After that wedding, Taylor lost his job. The Turner empire fell into crisis as scandals began flooding the media through anonymous email leaks. Of course, I have no idea who sent them. Stephanie stepped down from the board. Georgia came under investigation for financial misconduct, and Holly. She disappeared, taking her 3 children and leaving Taylor with a mountain of debt from the wedding that never finished. I didn't feel triumphant. I only felt calm. Just like when Liam took his first wobbly steps, I didn't cry from emotion. I simply smiled because I knew at last I was living a life I had chosen. I returned to work, not at the law firm nor the old company. I opened a small bookshop where I named each shelf after things women should never forget, worth freedom, truth, and voice. Sometimes people would recognize me as that woman from the viral wedding clip. They whispered, they stared, they clucked their tongues. I didn't care. I no longer lived to please anyone. Once a young woman came into the shop. She bought a book on child custody rights and asked me, "Were you ever afraid?" Standing alone against an entire family, I replied, "It's not that I was never afraid. I was just afraid of one thing, that if I did nothing, my son would grow up believing that it's normal for his mother to be weak." She hugged me for a long time. That was the first time in many years that I felt my heart wasn't racing from rage or pain. It was simply still, like a lake after the storm. And in that moment, I knew I had won, not by destroying anyone, but by becoming myself again. Chapter 7, Becoming the Mother I Never Had. When I was little, my mother once told me, a woman can lose everything, but if she still has her hands and a heart not yet hardened, she can always start over. Back then, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not until I became a mother. To me, motherhood isn't just about changing diapers, mixing formula, or soothing a crying child at 3 a.m. Motherhood is learning how to be resilient even when your heart is shattered. It's bracing yourself against judgmental stares just because you don't come from a prestigious bloodline. It's swallowing your tears when your child asks, "Mom, why didn't Grandma come to my birthday? I didn't want Liam to grow up bitter. I didn't want him to believe that revenge is the only path to healing. But I did want him to know the truth." I told him about his grandfather, the man who spent his life raising me on modest wages, but who always held his head high. I told him about his grandmother, the woman who passed away early, yet left me a legacy of self-respect. I told him about his mother, about a time when she was so fragile she let others dictate her very existence, but who then stood up without demanding anyone's pity. Every night before he sleeps, I tell Liam one thing: you are the one thing I'll never regret. And perhaps he's the very reason I didn't turn into a ruthless version of them. I didn't retaliate by hurting them. I didn't go public slander or use the media to reclaim my dignity. I simply walked away quietly with my child in my arms and chose to live a better life. As for them, if they suffer, if they've lost something, that's the consequence of their choice to push someone like me out of their lives. Once Liam asked me, "Mom, why don't we live in a big house like before?" I pulled him into my arms, whispered, "Because I chose a place where you can grow up without ever needing to bow your head." He didn't ask anything else. He just hugged me tighter, and in his eyes I saw a kind of trust no inheritance could ever bring. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize the woman standing there. Not because I've changed physically, but because I no longer drop my gaze when I see my own reflection. I was once labeled a failed mother, a discarded wife, a voiceless shadow in a prestigious family. Now I am a self-sufficient mother, a woman who owns her voice, and the only one brave enough to walk away, even when every other door slammed shut. And if anyone were to ask me, "What makes you most proud?" I wouldn't hesitate to answer, I didn't just raise a child. I re-raised myself from a broken daughter into a mother who knows how to love herself properly. Chapter 8. When Darkness Devours Itself. Peaceful life never lasts forever, but this time disruption no longer made me tremble the way it once had. One early autumn afternoon, as I was closing the accounts for my little bookstore, the phone rang. An unknown number. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. The man's voice on the other end was hoarse-weary. "Sarah, is that you?" It was Taylor. I sat down silent. He drew in a long breath as if trying to swallow his humiliation in one gulp. I want to see Liam. I know I was wrong, very wrong, but that boy is my blood, my son. I have the right. I cut him off. Calmly. Without anger, without venom, you once said my child wasn't yours. You once let your mother tear apart his birth certificate. You once signed away your parental rights without even reading the paper. You chose. And now, I choose. Silence, stretching out like a bottomless void. I didn't need to hear more. I hung up. That night I sat beside Liam as he did his homework. I didn't mention the call. I just watched him, his small hands carefully shaping each letter, and I felt grateful for the pain that had taught me how to love the right way. A few weeks later, I heard that Taylor was selling his luxury apartment downtown. His company was under financial investigation. Georgia, his sister, was indicted after evidence surfaced that she had siphoned welfare funds for personal use. Stephanie, his mother, suddenly suffered a stroke and was left bedridden, with no one to care for her. People said it was karma. I wasn't sure I believed in karma, but I did believe in this truth that if you live by lies, you will die in loneliness without a soul to mourn you. One afternoon, I received a handwritten letter sent from a private nursing home. It was from Stephanie. I was stunned. The handwriting was shaky, clumsy, yet she still clung to her arrogance. I'm not writing to apologize, because I don't think a woman like you is big enough to forgive. But if there's one thing I did right in my life, it was giving birth to my son, and you destroyed him. I folded the letter and tucked it carefully into a drawer. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because I wanted to remember that even at the very end, some people would rather choose hatred than learn responsibility. I didn't reply. A few months later, I heard she had died. No one came to claim her body, and perhaps that was her greatest fear all along, to die without being remembered. As for me, I lived on, not needing their recognition, not needing their apologies. I lived, and each day was proof that women may hurt, but no one can drown them unless they allow it. Chapter 9. A Quiet Victory. I once thought revenge meant shouting in the crowd, toppling those who had scorned me, forcing them to kneel and beg for forgiveness. But no, reality was far different. True victory is when you no longer need them to look back in order for you to exist. After everything, I no longer lived to take revenge. I lived to nurture peace within myself. And the very first thing I did was forgive myself. Forgive myself for staying too long. Forgive myself for once being so cowardly that I believed silence was the only way to hold a family together. Forgive myself for letting others write my fate for me. I began rewriting it, not with schemes of retaliation, but with simple things: opening a bookstore, hosting free reading sessions for women who had suffered abuse, adopting a stray cat, something Taylor had once forbidden because cats scratch hardwood floors. Liam and I decorated the house together for every holiday. We baked Christmas cookies, arranged flowers every Sunday morning, laughed more, cried less. I no longer startled at the sound of a knock at the door. I no longer dreamt of being shoved down the stairs, nor heard my mother-in-law's voice echoing in my head, calling me a woman who couldn't keep her husband. I had silenced all of that. One afternoon, when sudden rain drove us indoors, Liam and I crowded into the kitchen to bake. He clumsily spilled flour all over the floor, then looked at me nervously, as if afraid of being scolded. I just laughed. I've never been upset about a messy floor. I'd only be upset if you grew up too afraid to make mistakes. Liam hugged me tight. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just won justice for myself. I had built a home one grounded in trust, in unconditional love, with no pretenses and no chains. That was something the Turner family, with all their wealth and prestige, could never understand. Someone once asked me, "Aren't you afraid that one day the past will come back?" I smiled. No, I survived the storm. Now I am the storm. Chapter 10. The Fall of Those Who Once Sat on the Throne. I heard about Taylor's bankruptcy on an ordinary morning while arranging books in my little shop. An old acquaintance from the city walked in, bought a book, and whispered, "He's lost everything. Failed investments. Friends turned their backs. The apartment's been sold. All that's left is debt." I wasn't surprised. When a person builds their entire life on lies and betrayal, collapse is only a matter of time. In Georgia, I saw her name in the papers, accused of embezzlement and abuse of power. She once mocked me for being unworthy of the Turner name. But now she stood in court, bowing before the very people she once looked down on. Stephanie. She passed away quietly in a nursing home. No friends, no family, not a single wreath bearing the name of her son or daughter. All she left behind was a rotten legacy: fear, selfishness, and hatred. People called it a tragedy, but to me it was simply the truth. A truth buried too long, finally exploding like a time bomb. One day when I took Liam to the park, he saw another child fall off his bike. He ran over, helped the boy up, brushed the dust off his knees, and said, "It's okay. When you fall, you just get back up." Watching that, I felt a relief I can hardly describe. I had feared my son would grow up carrying wounds like mine, feared he would inherit the darkness I once bore. But no. He was different, strong yet gentle. He was the result of everything I had chosen: silence at the right moments, battles, in the right places, steps in the right direction. I realized then, the most beautiful revenge isn't watching your enemies kneel. It's seeing your child smile in a world no longer weighed down by their darkness. I no longer longed for an apology. I didn't need recognition. I already had the most precious thing: peace in my own home and the light in my son's eyes. As for the Turner family, they chose their path, and now they must live, or rather die, with the consequences of it. I turned to Liam and said softly, "Son, I once lost everything. But since I had you, I've understood one thing. Losing everything isn't what's terrifying. What's terrifying is losing yourself, and I will never let that happen again." Liam squeezed my hand tightly, and in that grasp, I heard a promise for the future. And I knew. This story at last had closed, not with tears, but with the beautiful stillness of a woman who had found herself again. Looking back, I no longer see a pitiful woman in the mirror. I see a resilient mother, a woman strong enough not to be broken, and a person who finally learned how to love herself. They wanted me silent, but that very silence became my weapon to watch, to plan, and to choose the exact moment to reclaim my life. I don't need their recognition. I don't need an apology. My greatest victory is the peace within this home and the smile on my son's face. Sometimes revenge isn't about bringing others down. It's about living a life they can never touch, and that is the sweetest victory of all.